Hello everyone, my name's Cliff and welcome back to my channel. This is Cliff's Dark Gems. Today we're going to be talking about my top 10 favourite horror authors of all time. Stay tuned. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of things clear. This is not a list of top 10 greatest horror authors of all time. We're not talking about horror authors that necessarily have had the biggest influence in the horror genre. This is my own personal list. So this is completely subjective. These are the top 10 horror authors that most influenced my reading, my love for horror, and my love for the horror genre. Here are some special mentions. First, Peter Straub. Excellent author in his own right. He's written horror, he's written crime and mystery, and I thoroughly enjoyed Ghost Story as well as Shadowland, which is more like a dark fantasy. I started one of his crime mystery series with Coco, but I didn't care for it very much, and for me he just doesn't quite make the cut here. Number 2, we have Thomas Harris, and my difficulty with Thomas Harris was, where do I put books like Silence of the Lambs? Is it a psychological thriller? Is it a suspense thriller? Now we all know that Hannibal the Lecter is probably the most iconic serial killer created, or one of the most iconic serial killers created in fiction, and he could well be in horror. And the more I think about it, maybe he should have been on this list, but he's out of the list just. Next we have Neil Gaiman, who's not strictly a horror author. He does write some excellent YA horror, like Coraline, which I've spoken about previously, and some excellent dark fiction, dark short fiction. But most of his adult horror, or most of his adult novels, are more creepy and unsettling as opposed to pure horror. So he doesn't make the list either. Okay everyone, now we get to our top 10. Now before I start, I'd just like to say that there may be a few obscure authors on here, as it is my personal list, and what I really hope is that if any of you have not heard of these authors, that after this video I might inspire you to pick them up and give them a go. Okay, in 10th place we have Anne Rice. Now I was a little bit unsure whether I was going to add her to this list, merely because I am not a fan of her erotic fiction or her religious fiction, and I also did not like the way that her series was pretty much going downhill after the Vampire Chronicles. It was almost as though she was just writing the same thing to get the same results, almost for money, and that's all there is to it. And I felt that if she had actually taken a little bit more care and taken a little bit more time with her novels, she could have actually produced some more masterpieces like the first 3 Vampire Chronicles. I want to say masterpieces. I think the Chronicles were hugely influential in changing the way we see vampires, and it was almost as if she created a bridge between Bram Stoker's old school gothic vampires and the way we see them now. Her vampires are well fleshed out. They have a sense of moral ambiguity, they have choice. Yes, they live forever, but they have their own problems. As a result, they retain their humanity in a way, and this I found fascinating in her novels. Therefore, I place her in 10th position, because although the rest of her work is below par for me, those first 3 novels have stood the test of time, and they are excellent examples of vampire horror. That's Anne Rice. Okay, next we have Edgar Allan Poe. Now many would say that this man has had the biggest influence on the horror genre, and the horror genre would not be anywhere where it is now without the influence of this author. And if there was ever an artist, or there was ever an author that you could say his art was a mirror for his life, then that is Edgar Allan Poe. Poe lived a miserable life. His dad left him shortly after he was born. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 3 years old, and later on when he married his first cousin, she was 13, he was 26. When she was 26, she also died of tuberculosis. After that, from the heartache, he took up drinking, he started taking opium, and in addition to that he had psychological problems. I did read somewhere online, maybe it was something to do with epilepsy, but anyway, this all had a heavy influence in the way that he wrote and in the themes that he wrote about. Just some of the scenes that are prevalent throughout his short stories and poems are suffering, paranoia, guilt, feelings of guilt, anxiety, and death. And this really shines through in so many of his works. And he would probably be high on my list if it wasn't for the fact that I haven't read enough of him. Some of my favorites, I mentioned The Pit and the Pendulum when I talked about short stories. I also love The Black Cat, and The Telltale Heart is horrifying. And some of his poems, The Raven, which is just probably his most well-known poem. That is Edgar Allan Poe at number 9. Okay, in 8th position we have a deeply loved, deeply respected and admired American author who is more well known for his science fiction, short stories and novels. He's also written fantasy, but he most definitely has written horror. And so that's why he's on my list, and that is none other than Ray Bradbury. Now, Something Wicked This Way Comes is my 3rd favourite horror novel of all time, and that alone almost ensures him a place on my list. But he has written so much short stories. Some of his short story collections are very dark, and I just think that he writes so beautifully, so imaginatively. His prose is more like poetry. It's just the way that he strings sentences together, and the imagery, it is just so deep and so beautiful. Now, there are 2 very interesting things about Ray Bradbury. Number 1, he said that when he died, he wanted his ashes to be put in a Campbell's tomato soup can and placed on Mars. Now, this didn't happen, but when he did die, which was a very sad moment, NASA paid him an incredible tribute. And when they landed one of their craft on Mars, the place where they landed, they named it Bradbury Landing, which I think is very, very special. Okay, everyone, in number 7th place is Michael McDowell, who I think is an incredibly underrated, underappreciated author. Sadly, he died of AIDS-related complications, so we never saw the best of him, or perhaps he was in his prime. But I've read The Elementals, which is awesome, as well as Cold Moon Over Babylon and The Amulet. Now, he's a Southern Gothic writer, and things that really stand out for me in his writing is his ability of place. He knows his place, and he knows his setting, and he knows how to develop the characters to the point where you really start investing in them. And he shows in this the real dark side of human nature, and he brings that out in his novels. There is always tension, there's always dread, and I just think he's just a wonderful writer. And if you haven't picked him up yet, do yourselves a favour. That's Michael McDowell. 2 interesting facts about Michael McDowell. After scouring the internet, I found out that he also wrote the screenplay for Beetlejuice, Tim Burton, as well as The Nightmare Before Christmas. And as a man who wrote about death and pain, one of his hobbies was to collect memorabilia concerned with death. For instance, he actually collected a young child's coffin and turned it into a coffee table. Now, it sounds pretty macabre, but hey, we all have our hobbies. Okay, in 6th position, there's no denying the power of his writing, the power of his storytelling, and the fact that he had a massive influence on the horror genre. And he's almost created his own subgenre within himself, and that is H.P. Lovecraft. Now, his themes include the vastness of the universe, the tininess, smallness of man, and that there is danger, and that if you venture out there into the unknown and the unknowable, and this terrifying thing is the unknown that he brings up in all his stories, and you venture too closely and you gaze upon it, you're going to be driven to madness and despair and suicide. He gave rise to the idea of cosmic horror as a subgenre, and has influenced everyone from Stephen King, The Mist, to The Thing by John Carpenter, movie, and pretty much everyone in between. Anywhere where there are tentacles and monsters and unexplainable terrors, that H.P. Lovecraft has his thumbprint on that. At number 5 we have another multi-talented author, and that is Dan Simmons. Now Dan Simmons writes crime, he writes thrillers, he writes science fiction, which he's incredibly well known for, as well as horror and historical horror. Now I've just recently read The Terror, set up in the Arctic with those two ships locked in the ice. I gave an extensive review about that, or a mini review, and that has shot up into my top 10 horror novels of all time, if not perhaps my top 20 novels of all time. He is that good. He also has written Carrie and Comfort, and now both these novels, for Dan Simmons, it's about the story and the pacing and dragging you into this world with the characters, so it's almost like you're there with them. He's very good at that. He's an absolutely exceptional storyteller, his characterizations, and in particular his pacing of the novel. I found with both of those two that I've read were exceptional, and for big 800-page novels I think that's very, very important. Okay, at number 4 we have an author who most definitely inherited some awesome genes from his daddy, and that is Joe Hill, son of Stephen King. And now, although he's standing in his daddy's shadow most of the time, I would argue that Joe Hill most definitely has his own voice and his own place. He has broken through into the horror world and he deserves to be there. His stories are deliciously dark and sometimes creepy and terrifying, and he really brings an originality to his storytelling, and something different, something that his father doesn't always bring. And for me that is that his characters are always flawed. Even the protagonist, like Vic McQueen in Nosferatu, is a flawed character. That Death Head Rocker, who's the protagonist in Heart-Shaped Box, and that is a flawed character as well. A very unlikable character that is being haunted by this dead man suit. In fact, all his books that I've read, and I've read a couple of his short stories, there is something different about Joe Hill to his father, which is a good thing. An interesting fact about Joe Hill is that when he was 7 years old, he had a minor part to play in the movie Creepshow, and he was a child at the beginning that was playing with a voodoo doll up in his room because his dad had just sent him to the room and thrown away his comics, and he was sticking pins into the voodoo doll. I'm just glad it was not the real thing, because I would have been very upset if it was Stephen King, and I'm just glad they're still both around today. Okay, for my number 3 author, that is Robert McCammon. Now I've only read 3 of his works, 2 longer novels, and that is Boy's Life and Swan Song, and a short story collection, Blue World, but he is fast becoming one of my favorite novelists of all time. His writing is superb, his storytelling magical, and he really drags you into the world. His world building in his post-apocalyptic tale of Swan Song is just something special to behold, and Boy's Life is just a beautiful, heartwarming coming of age story. I don't know, I have to get my hands on more Robert McCammon so that I can truly justify him being in my 3rd spot, but that's where he is at this time. Interesting thing is, his grandparents, who he lived with and was brought up with, never read, and sadly didn't read any of his books, but he read a lot, and he's ended up studying journalism, and he was writing short stories at the same time, trying to get them published with the newspaper he worked for, but he just kept hitting a dead end. The editor refused to accept his work. In the meantime, he was writing his first novel, and that was Baal, And so that when Ball was published, that was his first novel and he could take up writing full time. Two other interesting facts about Robert McCammon is that at some stage, and I'm not sure if I get all my facts straight here, but I got it from the internet, is that boy's life at one stage was going to be banned from a school as a result of swearing. And Robert McCammon got in his car and actually drove to the school and defended his work. He didn't want it to be tarnished, and he won the battle, which is awesome. Second of all, he came up with, he actually created the Horror Writers Association to create a community for fellow horror writers, a sense of belonging. That is Robert McCammon. In number 2 position, we have a multi-talented painter, artist, writer, filmmaker, even playwright, and that is Clive Barker. Now, Clive Barker is a visionary, and he has had a huge impact on the horror community. He has changed the face of horror, and even Stephen King says he is the future of horror. That was back in the 80s. And he influenced things like body horror, splatterpunk, because his writing style is not so subtle in terms of his horror. He does put everything out there. When he writes about things like sex, death and violence, he's not afraid to show you his demons. He's not afraid to show you his magic and put it out there in front of you. He labels his own work as the fantastique, which is kind of an overlapping between fantasy and horror, and where the real world often overlaps or mingles with the more imaginary world of monsters and darkness and creatures. A lot of his work is more categorized as dark fantasy, and I think I prefer that, but there are always elements of horror in that work as well. 2 interesting facts about Clyde Barker. Number 1 is that he very nearly died after a routine trip to the dentist where toxins were accidentally put into his blood. He fell into a coma, but very luckily he survived and he recovered, and I am very thankful for that, for one. Second, did I tell you that Stephen King is terrified of Clive Barker? Or scared of him, maybe not terrified. Okay, next, finally, we have the one and only Stephen King, who came bursting onto the scene in the 1970s and has pretty much dominated the world of horror ever since. It's almost as if he's got his finger on the pulse of humanity and what makes us tick. And when you get into his stories, you can't get out. He draws you into his world. His characters are just so real that you get lost, and you get lost into his imagination. And obviously he's changed. He's been a prolific writer through his whole life. From the 70s up to the present day, he's still writing. And I really think anyone who considers themselves a reader of horror has to try at least read Stephen King. Of course, often with huge success and literary success in a genre, you're going to get these snobs that criticize you. And Stephen King in his early days faced a lot of criticism from these literary types who would talk down on his work. His response to them was to basically put his head down and keep on working, keep on writing. And really, the fact that people do not appreciate the fact that he can tell a good story, I find that just sad. Interesting fact is that he came up with the pseudonym Richard Bachman. For a lot of his earlier work, he wrote under that alias. And he was in his office one day, and on his desk was a book by Richard Stark. Now, that was also a pseudonym for another author, and playing on his radio at the time, no, sorry, not his radio, his record player, remember those? Was Bachman Turner Overdrives, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet, and so he came up with Richard Bachman. Okay everyone, so that's my list of my own personal top 10 favourite horror authors of all time. I hope you enjoyed that. Please let me know what you think in the dark spaces below, and tell me what your favourite authors are. Did I surprise you with my list? Let me know. please be sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And up until next time, keep those pages turning, take care, and cheers.